Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with you all, dear friends, as we join together in fellowship for the 45th anniversary of the Cardinal's dinner. And I'm delighted to see all of you here in great numbers, to share some quality time in a neighborly and fraternal fashion. Partaking of an exquisite meal, we strengthen the bonds of community and we raise funds for a number of worthy social causes and charities. I thank wholeheartedly Dr. Colin Saldana for accepting to be this year's chair, and I celebrate with you the enormous and outstanding work accomplished by him and the committee in making this event a memorable and congenial one for all. And I must likewise recognize the many members of our staff and volunteers at the Pastoral Center and across the Archdiocese who have provided countless hours of heartfelt commitment for the success of this annual and much-awaited get-together. So as we gather this evening in downtown Toronto, I would begin by underscoring the importance of simply being here, of showing up, of accepting our invitation. And it means a lot to us. No doubt you could have been otherwise engaged in a number of other praiseworthy activities tonight. Yet you chose to be here and to join others in an encounter of convivial networking and support for the Church, while acknowledging her essential role in the public square, in society, in the lives of many people. And we are here, men and women from across the GTA and beyond, representing not only Catholic Toronto, but the various sectors of life as we experience it here, a cross-section of religious and secular. We acknowledge in particular the presence of His Excellency Archbishop Ivan Jurkovic, the Apostolic Nuncio to Canada, and his dedicated staff. We acknowledge our Emeritus Archbishop Cardinal Thomas Collins, our 4 auxiliary bishops, brother bishops from the Toronto Ecclesiastical Province and Eastern Catholic eparchies, our devoted and zealous priests and deacons, seminarians, and consecrated religious men and women, and of course the students and the young people. Let's applaud the students and the young people here. Members of our parishes and our schools, both publicly funded and independent, committed staff and volunteers of our seminaries, institutes, university, as well as healthcare and social outreach agencies. We salute our fellow Catholics, Christians of different churches and ecclesial communities, Indigenous persons, friends from the many different faith traditions, and an array of other individuals embodying various religious and spiritual expressions. We're pleased to note the presence of professionals stemming from the world of finance, banking, and communications, culture, and the arts. We're grateful for those among us here who are in public office, our elected officials, from the federal, provincial, municipal, local levels. The Honorable Filomena Tassi from the federal government, the Honorable Todd McCarthy, the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, Mr. Nando Yanika, Chair of the Region of Peel, representing all the other mayors and municipalities within the Archdiocese. Our very own Chief Myron Demkew of the Toronto Police Services, as well as all the many other men and women at the service of the people in civil and community engagement. Thank you for your many self-sacrifices, your caring, and for your generous labor in favor of the common good. I'd like to mention as well that according to my reading, in terms of Toronto's economic recovery, most recently, there has been a 100% rise in the rate of employment. You see, just 1 year ago at this very event, there was one cardinal, and now we're up to 2. So, employment's going up. This afternoon, I spoke with my father on the telephone to see how things were going. So he asked me, what are you going to do tonight? I says, Pa, I'm going to explain to him we're going to have about 1,400 of our closest and dearest friends over for dinner. At that point, he paused, and after a short silence, he said, Bravo, buon appetito. So there you have it. My dad's a man of few words. In any event, I sure do hope that everyone is enjoying the scrumptious meal and the amicable ambiance and the affable fellowship of this evening. I would be remiss if I did not mention how globally we are at this time in the midst of a considerable event with foreseeable dire consequences. We're on the cusp of witnessing and experiencing, as it were, a momentous occurrence to take place very, very soon. Partisan lines have been drawn, emotions are running high, and the anticipation and nervousness of the outcome is at its peak. Of course, I'm speaking of this Saturday's game of the Leafs versus the Habs here in Toronto. Indulge me, if you will, now for some brief moments, which I will heartfully embrace so as to share and convey on a more serious note a few thoughts and considerations to accompany the coffee and the dessert. So it's no secret that for many of our contemporaries, we're living in somewhat chaotic times with strife, hardships, and anxiety. I've been meandering somewhat on the state of affairs that causes enormous grief for many and is destructive at every level. I'm referring to the detrimental societal divisions at the local and global scale. One does not need much prompting to come to understand to what extent the world in which we live, our world, in many ways is wounded. Some might say fractured, fragmented, or just plain ill. Intimately related to this condition is the growing sense of an increasing lack of social cohesiveness, a dreadful polarization and divisiveness which we observe on TV and the mass media, but that we likewise experience in our own lives, in our relationships, in the circumstances in which we live, and dare I say, in the church in which we worship. I've been thinking a lot about what we can do, what we ought to do, so as to be agents of positive change and bring about healing to the woundedness, restoration to the brokenness, mending the fractures, piecing together the fragments, and providing health to the social ills at hand. As I brought this to prayer and reflection, providentially I might say, I found myself not too long ago on a brief spiritual retreat in a Benedictine abbey. Monasteries are some of my favorite places to go and to stay. As I contemplated the oftentimes sorrowful situation we find ourselves in globally, I turned to the perennial, age-old wisdom found in the monastic tradition. Plunging into the depths of those masters of the human soul and of the human condition, I came to a place of consolation and inspiration. Allow me to share some of the golden nuggets I discovered in my spiritual mining exercise. I look back to my recent and graced stay at the monastery and the words I read, the conversations I had, the thoughts came to me. The Father Abbot in the monastery mentioned that the great and holy rule of Saint Benedict, founder of Western monasticism, penned over 1,500 years ago, actually contains glimpses of hope for today's times. Though we're not monastics ourselves, the insights we find therein are nonetheless surprisingly applicable to our situation. It is a well-known fact that Saint Benedict himself lived in chaotic, confusing, and disruptive times similar to ours. What was a eureka moment for me, reflecting in the monastery setting, was the realization that there is an antidote to the many and destructive kinds of polarization. A renewed sense of community, and one that is grounded and nourished in faith, prayer, and spirituality. To be perfectly honest, life in community is not an easy exploit, since there are bound to be competition, envy, jealousy, bickering, and disagreements wherever humans are. On the other hand, for those of us who are not called to a life in the cloister, involved engagement in society does not necessarily constitute a community. A family is usually a community, and often so a neighborhood. But society, in its larger sense, does not typically share the values of deep altruism and self-gift, which are essential building blocks of community. Likewise, it is difficult to find in society that special kind of mutual and sacrificial, ablative love that characterizes true community life. So what can we learn from monastic wisdom that may be applied to our circumstances, albeit with a grain or two of salt? First, Saint Benedict, founder of Western monasticism, in his rule, insists on the need to cultivate a way of speaking and of acting that will enhance and not divide communal life. His remedy for polarization, as it were, can be discerned in these words, and I quote, "Your way of acting should be different from the world's way. Never let a hollow greeting of peace, never give a hollow greeting of peace or turn away when someone needs your love. Speak the truth with heart and tongue." Here we have three purposeful and profound, yet simple suggestions that could very well transform social, familial, ecclesial, and political discourse if we never spoke hollow words of affection to each other, if we never turned away when someone needed an expression of our love, and if we always spoke truthfully from the heart, we would find ourselves fashioning a different kind of world and enjoying real community. However, to live with this degree of authenticity and transparency requires reflection and prayer, or as we would say today, intentionality, avoiding, as it were, the typical unconsciousness we feel in hollow, everyday speech and in our neglect of those around us. 2, learning the art of authentic listening. I believe this will help dissipate polarization. It is a spiritual practice which produces outstanding temporal benefits if allowed to take place. Listening as an act of faith and devotion draws us closer to God and provides us with that invaluable insight into our true selves, allowing community building to emerge. Authentic listening is often referred to as empathetic, inasmuch as we strive to understand suspending assumptions and judgments. In other words, it is seeking to walk in another's shoes, even if they are a size or two too small. Have you noticed how all around us there are people who feel invisible, unheard, and lonely? Well, this special kind of listening involves foremost paying attention to people's unique experience. Now, St. Benedict begins his rule, the prologue, with the beautiful and touching words, "Listen, my child, to the instructions of the teacher, and attend to them with the ear of your heart." The original Latin is beautiful. "Obsculta, o fili, precepta magistri, et incline aurem cordis tui." To listen with the ear of the heart. To incline the ear is to turn one's ear toward the speaker, or place a hand behind one's ear to push it out to funnel sound into it more clearly. The heart, too, has an ear in a spiritual sense. The more we're committed to incline the ear of our heart, the more understanding we will be. A few years ago, when I was first appointed bishop, a Benedictine monk, a friend of mine with whom I did graduate study back in the day in the United States, he sent me a short message, which I would refer today as a keeper. He saw similarities between the ministry of a bishop and that of the abbot in a monastery. He encouraged me, and noting that listening, in his words, is the key to union with God and pastoral service to God's people. You are prepared to listen with care. I regularly call to mind these anointed words, though I'm far from perfectly putting them into practice. To listen with care, to listen with the heart. It's not easy, however, since it requires of us great interior stability, realizing and accepting that we no longer need to prove ourselves by discourses, arguments, or defenses. Listening with the ear of our heart. 3. It's a common understanding that the anxiety level experienced in our day has certainly increased in the recent past. And today many people admit that they need a way out of the chaos, the messiness, the busyness, and the polarizing aspects of daily toil. One further dimension of polarization is the systematic fragmentation of collaboration among ourselves, as well as cordial engagements between individuals. Siloing ourselves through constant and unbridled exposure to social media, and especially in the often ideological-driven blogospheres, we risk ourselves becoming ever more vulnerable to increasing self-referential, narcissistic patterns of cyber-fed behaviors. We know over so well that polarization, more often than not, promotes an endless cycle of fear and unrest, and contributes to isolation and ultimately self-destruction, which manifests its way in many ways. For many, social media is jeopardizing their lives and maybe even their salvation. Now, we know the obvious benefits of social media, including the unbelievable wealth of data available and the helpful resource it can be. By any stretch of the imagination can we perceive at our very fingertips what can be defined as seemingly infinite reserve of information, creativity, entertainment, and even inspiration sometimes. Added to this is a means of being able to connect in such a way that we had never seen before. However, without being naive, we also know and experience in our lives the downsides as well. For instance, Instagram has been known to increase anxiety. One can't even do a simple search on TikTok without experiencing some form of a thirst trap. And then we have those treacherous YouTube comments, a virtual cesspool of division and ignorance, not to mention that the goal of all social media is to keep you on the app as long as possible. Let's just think of all the hours we spent on scrolling and scrolling, when we could have put that time to better use by praying, studying, a hobby, reaching out to others, or being of service to the community. Not to mention talking to real human beings. It's a lot, and we have to ask ourselves, is it keeping us from living in and by God's kingdom in a real way? For many, social media has become a net negative in daily life, a real source of anxiety and therefore of suffering. Even if it does not really take over our life, where we find ourselves in a downward spiral phase, the question is, why would we wait for that to happen? Why entertain an obviously unhealthy habit? We might feel ourselves not where we want to be, where God wants us to be. It's time to look at this differently and how it is contributing to the darkness, divisions, and polarization in our world, and especially our young people. Lest we forget, we're called to live in authentic freedom, one that requires engaging in healthier habits, virtuous habits, resetting our approach before it gets too bad. As a remedy to this potential existential implosion, we turn to the community-oriented way of life, which includes, as one Benedictine monk stated, engaging in acts of self-knowledge, honesty, self-acceptance, humility, and self-gift, hospitality. These acts of true community living will allow for peaceful dwelling to emerge from the chaos and fellowship to reign gloriously among us. 4. One important trait of Benedictine spirituality is hospitality. For 1,500 years, this attribute to living life differently has provided a welcoming presence for countless people, seeing each other as equal in dignity and beloved by God, though imperfect and wounded in their own way. Far from entertaining a Pollyanna perspective about human nature, Saint Benedict saw the practice of seeing Christ in every person, no matter how irritating they may be, as the key to spiritual growth. This practice reminds me of the time when I was a young seminarian, just entered the seminary in 1990. We would go out and retreat to Benedictine Abbey, and the monk, the abbot, he would greet us in front of the refectory washing our hands. Not because they were dirty. Hospitality. In our common parlance and outlook, hospitality has been watered down to mean friendly treatment of guests or strangers. However, it has a deeper significance. Hospitality, hospital, comes from the same Latin word hospes, which means guest. Christian hospitality led to the building of hospitals and hospices because Christians were to recognize Jesus himself in those who were, for one reason or another, had to travel, and especially the sick and the suffering, the poor, the pilgrim, somebody to care for. Medieval monasteries often served at what would refer today as modern-day hostels. Travelers were treated as guests and given food, lodging, and were cared for. Over the door of the monastery was the Benedictine motto, Hospes venit, Christus venit, when a guest comes, it's Christ who comes. Hospitality is not just extending kindness to a guest or a stranger. It's doing so because we see Christ in that person. Jesus says that those who give a cup of cold water in his name will not lose their reward. Where there is true hospitality, both guest and host or hostess receive new life, and community life is strengthened. Finally, there is a delightful and challenging expression which we find in St. Benedict's writing. In the prologue, as he sets out to unveil the depths of this new way of life, he advises the following instructions. You will run with your heart expanded by the unspeakable sweetness of love. You will run with your heart expanded with the unspeakable sweetness of love. This quality of being, of living, the spiritual, metaphysical running each day moving forward, and he doesn't mean the morning jog. It's a challenge to us and points us decidedly to our common goal, to grow the goodness of our heart. And the outward sign of that growth will be our unspeakable sweetness. This is another way of saying that we will radiate the harmony and peace inside of us as we strive to build community outside of us. As we put into practice these spiritual and practical exercises, our hearts will expand exponentially, interiorly, which in turn will allow community to grow among us exteriorly. One marked by security and peace, trust and compassion, truth and generosity. In other words, a life of unspeakable sweetness of love. In conclusion, it is evident to me that even in the midst of our busy life, we can certainly practice the spirit of this holy rule of St. Benedict without needing to abandon our responsibilities, our commitments and employment, and head for the hills to the nearest monastery. The wisdom of this 6th century Italian monk is as fresh and relevant today as it ever was. The rule has much to offer us as it highlights ways to nurture respectful relationships and compassionate leadership. It guides us in forming a heart open to God and open to others. Likewise, the spiritual and practical antidotes to polarization underscored are guideposts into a new way of community living. Now, to be perfectly honest, as St. Benedict was proposing to his monks his rule for true community building, his fellow monks, friends, colleagues, closest collaborators did in fact try to murder him by poisoning his cup of wine. Just to be clear, in no way does this fact have any bearing on the decision for me not to drink any alcohol. However, it does speak to the human condition at work even in ideal settings and struggle to keep trying even when not everybody's on board with the plan. Ultimately, it starts with me. Dismantling polarization and embodying a true sense of community begins with the first person singular. As I close, allow me to appeal to you wholeheartedly. As many in this room carry the burden of great responsibilities and therefore potential for great transformations. In seeking solutions to arduous challenges, from time immemorial, men and women have been handicapped by ignorance prejudice, and mental inertia. This is not to be among us. Despite the difficulties we may encounter, I want to encourage us this evening, endeavoring to bind the wounds of society, to be resolutely intent on striving for what is greater, for what is virtuous, for what is life-giving, for what is wholesome, for what is holy. Thus doing away with unhealthy practices and attitudes like indifference and self-sufficiency, arrogant pride and mistrust, pettiness and vindictiveness, public indecency and violence, duplicity and envy, defeatism and discouragement. Rather, with personal integrity and a heaping measure of goodwill, working in unison, focused on building a true sense of community within our larger society, and embodying the virtues that stood the test of time, we shall indeed overcome dreadful polarization and deadly divisions. We shall experience life in abundance, and together enjoy the blessings of every day. For as St. Paul reassured the Romans, we all belong to one another. Thank you for the joy of your company, and God bless you.